Welcome to the Sounds of Resistance channel. The Ukrainian army is currently fighting the most determined freedom struggle in its history. The brave Ukrainian army, which reflects this determination to all fronts in the later stages of the war, regrets that Russia started to invade Ukraine on February 24th. Zelensky's fighters, who continue their freedom operations without slowing down, are liberating the occupied Ukrainian lands one by one. Russian leader Vladimir Putin recently announced that he has annexed 4 regions of Ukraine. Announcing this decision with an official ceremony, Vladimir Putin stated that the so-called referendum results and the cities of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia belong to Russia. Putin's annexation decision, which was not accepted by many world states, received quite a reaction. The Russian leader thought that he could undo the defeats on the battlefield with an annexation decision that no one had seen official, and that he could prevent the Ukrainian advance. But Vladimir Putin failed in this plan, as he did in every step he took. Even the citizens of his own country did not support the Russian leader's decision to annex. The local people of Russia want neither Kherson nor Donetsk nor Luhansk. All Russian citizens want is for the risky political gamble of Vladimir Putin to end as soon as possible. Because every time the Russian leader rolls the dice, something is missing from Russia. Either the losses of the Russian army are increasing, or the Russian people are suffering the consequences of the sanctions imposed on Russia. The Ukraine-Russia war is currently only doing harm to the Russians. The Russian people are aware of this, but their leaders, Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin administration, do not understand that the war is hurting Russia. Since February 24th, Russia's troop loss has exceeded 60,000, easy to say 60,000 Russian soldiers, and military equipment such as war equipment, armored vehicles, warplanes were missing from the Russian army. Unable to prevent all these losses, the Russian leader's first statements after announcing the annexation of 4 regions of Ukraine, as we mentioned, are truly tragicomic. Vladimir Putin stated that the cities of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia should now be counted as Russian territories, with a so-called referendum. Only 24 hours have passed since this announcement. Ukraine recaptured the city of Liman from the Russians, the Russian leader's first fiasco on this issue. Russian leader Vladimir Putin managed to be disgraced for the second time after the annexation decision, and the Russian army was completely withdrawn for the second time in just 2 weeks. The heroic Ukrainian army smashed the Russians in Kherson with a sudden dawn operation. The Ukrainian counterattack operation, which has already been carried out in a planned manner, burned the Russian troops. 60 Ukrainian tanks and 4 motorized rifle battalions participated in this huge Kherson operation. The huge Ukrainian army had begun to infiltrate from the right bank of the Dnieper towards the Kherson region. The heroic Ukrainian army, which got quieter as it approached Kherson, made the Russians listen only to the sounds of death breath. The Russian army noticed the Ukrainian counterattack too late. The Ukrainian army, which started its suffocating attacks, began to stifle the Russian troops in Kherson. Most Russian soldiers couldn't even get their heads out of the front. As a result of the hot conflict that lasted for a long time, the Russian troops began to withdraw from the region. Because the Russian forces, who could not predict that they would find such a powerful attack, could only think of saving their lives in astonishment. After all this turmoil, the heroic Ukrainian army soldiers waved the glorious Ukrainian flag in the Kherson region. As a result of this magnificent operation, organized by Ukraine, even Russian media channels acknowledged the power of Ukraine. After the Ukrainian Dawn operation, Russian media channels stated that the Russian army blazed with a very strong Ukrainian unit, and that the Ukrainian attacks were very severe. Russian leader Vladimir Putin had decided to annex this region just a few days ago. Caught in the throes of enthusiasm, the Russian leader was shocked by the sudden liberation operation now organized by the heroic soldiers of Ukraine. The annexation decision taken by Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who was once again disgraced in the world political arena, has also become invalid and ineffective. Currently, the annexation decision about the 4 regions of Ukraine, which only Putin, the Kremlin administration, and North Korea consider official, has now become a topic of entertainment for the whole world. Even the Russian Defense Ministry made flash statements about the Ukrainian operation in Kherson. A spokesperson for the Russian Defense Ministry said, "In the Nikolaev-Kryvyi Rog direction, the Kiev regime simultaneously attempted an attack on the tactical directions of Nikolaev, Andreev, and Kryvyi Rog. The most effective offensive operations with the forces of 6 battalions of the Armed Forces of Ukraine including 2 tanks, were carried out in the direction of the settlement of Davidov Brod. At the same time, 2 reinforced tactical battalions of the Ukrainian armed forces launched an attack on the positions of Russian troops in the settlements of Bruskinskoye and Komstromka, expressing the strength of Ukraine for the first time in a long time. The Russian administration now has nowhere to run. We look forward to seeing how Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin method, who must be held accountable by the Russian people, will cover up this crushing Kherson defeat. To this day, all the failures that have occurred in Russia have been chosen as a victim and laid on him. Now, on whom will the disappointment of Kherson fall? Russian citizens no longer have patience. The Russian leader had fallen out of favor with his people with the mobilization decision, which he placed a lot of hope in. Because with the mobilization decision announced in Russia, thousands of Russian citizens who were far from military training were sent to die in Ukraine. It is still not clear how much the Russians lost in Kherson at the moment, but it is known that dozens of Russian soldiers were killed. Some of the Russian soldiers killed as a result of the operation organized by the Ukrainian heroes are also voluntary Russian citizens who were sent to Ukraine with the mobilization decree. How the Russian leader will account for all this to his own people, and what kind of barricade he will put in front of the people's revolts that are expected to break out in Russia, are awaited with curiosity. Prior to the Kherson defeat, Vladimir Putin had managed to curb protests in his country. But now the citizens of Russia are inflamed even more with the recent Kherson defeat. The number of citizens detained after participating in anti-mobilization protests in Russia has exceeded 2,500. The Russian people who do not care about criminal sanctions continue their protests, even as the arrests continue. And also, it's claimed that with this Kherson defeat, a huge protest will be held in Moscow Square in Russia. But it's not known how long the dictatorial leader will allow this. Especially in this process, Russian leader Vladimir Putin completely broke the ties with his people. Russian citizens no longer want to see Putin's power in any way. After the Ukrainian President Zelensky's appeals to Russian citizens, the Russian local population is fed up with Putin's imposition of a regime of oppression and fear. Currently, professional Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine now want to leave the Ukrainian fronts and return to their homes. The rate of fleeing the fronts of Russian soldiers who do not even have a shred of faith in the war is increasing day by day. The reason for this situation is quite obvious. Stunned by the huge victories of the Ukrainian heroes, the Russian army was convinced that the course of the war could not be turned in favor of the Russians. Even top Russian generals are at odds with Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin administration. Anticipating the course of conflicts in parts of Ukraine, these Russian top generals often intervened with their soldiers and tried to prevent casualties. However, the Kremlin administration and Russian leader Putin have repeatedly rejected the Russian top general's decision to withdraw, bringing the losses of the Russian army to its peak. This communication gap between the Russian administration and the Russian army is likely to change the course of the war drastically. Don't forget to follow us to be aware of hot developments. Thanks for watching.